There we go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on maintaining excellent collection development. I'm Jamie Machik with the Nicolet Federated Library System, and this is our last webinar, you could say, for the spring season. I'm working on some events for summer and fall, and I'm hoping to have that schedule out in June. So we hope you enjoy this last session of our spring season. With me today is Jeremy Bolom, and he is the head of public service at the Lincoln Parish Library in Ruston, Louisiana. And he's done a few programs for us before, I believe, on weeding and collection and on book displays and collection displays, and he's done a great job with those. And we were talking before the program, and he was telling me how right after he agreed to do this program, they had some bad weather in Louisiana, and 2 trees fell on his home. So we're very happy that he's with us today and agreed to do this. And as always, we know he'll do a great job. So, Jeremy,
we hope so.
Thanks again for being with us. And whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us this morning. I hope you get a lot of good information out of this. It's going to basically be kind of like a conversation that I would have with a staff member if I were explaining what is collection development. And when I looked at Jamie's title, she had maintaining excellent collection development, which kind of brings in a whole nother aspect. So you're going to get a little bit of library science ease this morning as well. Well, my slides are not advancing. There we go. So what is collection development? Of course, I have to give you a book definition, and there is a wonderful textbook, if you would like to spend the time with it, that ALA Editions has published called Fundamentals of Collection Development and Management. And in the introduction, they define collection development as several activities about developing library collections. And this includes a lot of different things that you think about, and most libraries divide them into specific departments. And if you're in a smaller library, you may do all of it, and that's kind of the function at our library, because we have one building that takes care of the entire parish, which is a county. So in the definition of this, it says that collection development is selection of materials, the determination and coordination of a selection policy, assessment of the needs of your users and potential users, a portion of budget management, identification of collection needs, community and user outreach and liaison, which is something that we're really not going to discuss today because that could be a whole nother presentation, planning for resource sharing, and perhaps it says e-resource contract review and negotiation, which is now a big part of what libraries are doing these days because we're on top of all those kinds of things. So that's the overall definition, but the easiest way to think about it is that it's part of the life cycle of materials in the library. And what I mean by the life cycle of materials, and if you were here for my weeding thing, I've mentioned the same thing, but there's 4 stages to the way materials come and go in the library. They're selected, they're processed, they're used, and then they're deselected at the time of the end of their life or the end of their function for the library. And if so selection is part of the whole process, collection management that is. So we'll be bouncing in and out of the life cycle, as you'll see as we go through the presentation. And of course, my thing about collection development, and I do a good bit of it here at our library, I think it's really fun. And the reason being is because you get to stay in the early know. You get advance notice of all the good titles that are coming out. And it's always really exciting to know when the next Baldacci is coming out, so you can tease people about it, or the next Grisham, because you know that he doesn't put out a book every other month like James Patterson. You'll also know when the movies are coming out, if that's the kind of selection you're doing. And my big thing, of course, is that you're doing true librarianship work. And why is that? Because this is the bigger picture of what we're doing. You are collecting. Making a collection, why are you making a collection, and for whom are you making that collection? And this goes back to the core values of librarianship. The first being the first laws that were ever written about librarianship by the Indian Ranganathan. I always say that name incorrectly, but he had 5 laws of librarianships, and he says books are for use, books are for all, every book has its reader, save the time of the reader, and the library is a growing organism. So that explains why are you collecting things. You're collecting things to give to the whom, the user, and you're gathering things that would be useful for the user. It also lines up with the ALA core values of librarianship. And if you're not familiar with these, they're listed in one of my favorite books that I like to go back to from time and time again when I need a little boost in professionalism, is the Portable MLIS book that one of my former professors at the University of Texas co-edited. But inside that is listed the ALA core values, and it talks about access, confidentiality and privacy, democracy, diversity, education and lifelong learning, intellectual freedom, preservation, the public good, professionalism, service, and social responsibility. Now that sounds like a lot of heavy things, but if you think about it, your collection supports every single one of those things. So if your collection does that, who is your collection for? Your collection is for the people that ALA, again, describes in the Library Bill of Rights. The resources you provide are for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all meaning your community that you serve. You're providing materials and information presented from various points of view and are not removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval by other members of your community. So again, you're serving all. You challenge censorship, which protects the all, your community. And you cooperate with those who are concerned with free expression. That's your intellectual freedom aspect, again, for everyone in your community. And then all people have a right to the library, so everyone has access to your collection. So that's a little bit of philosophy and higher librarianship thinking if you want to. But now we'll get into more of the nuts and bolts. So when you're building a collection, these are the 3 main things that, and they're mentioned in the book that I talked about in the beginning, that are portions of that definition. And the main ones are policy, procedures, and your budget. So policy, or the library collection vision. Everybody should have a library policy on collections. And what should this thing have in it is a definition of your collection, the philosophy of your collection, like what is the library's philosophy of collection, the library goal for the collection, because there should be an aim, not just a philosophy, but some kind of goal that you're trying to reach, and then the community that you're serving at the same time. Another thing you want to make sure that your policy has, and if you don't, then it can lead into a lot of issues, and I'm just throwing this in there as a little how-to, but is to make sure that you have a way to handle gifts and donations from the public, because that can sometimes contradict your philosophy, your goals, and what you're trying to do for your community. And then conversely, it needs to have a way to deal with reconsideration when somebody in the community raises a red flag about something that you've got in your collection. And as a side note, because weeding is part of the life cycle, so therefore part of collection management, is that you should also have a weeding policy that explains why you're weeding and what you're weeding and when you're weeding. That's as a little aside as well. So next would be procedures, or the what, how, and by whom that kind of thing is going on. So what are you collecting, who is collecting it, and how it is done. So that's going to be your manual, your nuts and bolts of how your library does collection. And for some small libraries, that might be living in somebody's head. Unfortunately, it's living in my head right now at my library, and that's really not a good thing, because we all know that people can come and go very quickly, and so you should have a written procedure for how things are done, because there are changes constantly in the way procedures are done. You could change vendors that you deal with, you could change systems that you're using, so it's good to keep update procedures for how you do things in your library. And thirdly, budget, or how much is spent. This is a good place of debate that can sometimes get staff members jealous about who gets to spend more, but sometimes budget is defined on how much you get to spend per collection. And when I say collection, that would be like nonfiction, fiction, children's, teen, adult materials. How much you get to spend by format. A lot of libraries say you get to spend so much on AV material, this much on print. Those numbers should be lined up well with how much those materials are used. So you want to analyze these numbers on a regular basis to make sure that you're not overspending on materials that are sitting on your shelves. That's always a big no-no. In other terms of budget, you could also be spending by branch, and hopefully the branch with the most circulation is getting a bigger chunk of the budget. There's no reason to spend a bunch of money for a branch that isn't performing as well as the others, unless a push in budget to boost that branch's collection might bring in more business. That's always a good thing to consider as well. So everybody loves a good collection, and what is a collection? A collection can be a group of subjects, and that mainly would fall under nonfiction. A collection of genres. Some libraries put all fiction A to Z. At my library, we do have specific genre collections, which is a little bit more like the bookstore model. Lots and lots of libraries are trying to serve their patrons better for browsing with this model. And I know some libraries are now going to the BISAC categories, which are truly bookstore models, and you may find contradictory Dewey numbers sometimes in those BISAC categories, and that's just the nature of the beast, so that's something to consider. You then have collections by age. Mainly children's is thought of this way, and teens and adult, but of course there can be overlap there as well. And then there's the different formats, which would be print, audiovisual materials, and then of course now we've moved into the digital age with ebooks, audiobook download, and even streaming video if you're in the hoopla realm. And then the other thing that you want to consider when you're collecting is where do you want to put it, and I again use the word collections, this is a loose term, of how you're going to group your materials together. So when I'm talking about collections, it's how you're grouping everything together. Is it a children's collection? Is it an adult collection? Is it a nonfiction collection? Is it a romance collection? Is it a Blu-ray collection? So those are what I'm going to, when I say collection, that's what I'm talking about. And then of course locations, that can mean anything. Where is it located in the library? What branch is it going to be located at? And this could also, location could also be a marketing tool to get people to go deeper into your library. Remember how the milk, eggs, and bread are always the furthest point from the door in a grocery store. So you can think of those kind of things if you're arranging your collections by location in your library. So essentially, collections is a two-step process. But if you think of a really fancy dance, and I don't know what kind of dance this would be, but the first step is where all of the gusto goes, and the second step is just to get you back to the first step. So the first step of collecting, you're going to basically examine the available items for purchase, and this could be going through a catalog, it could be going through a website, it could be considering patron requests, but however it's done, then you will analyze each one of those titles with the following points. You need to ask yourself, how does it actually fit into the collection? Sorry, I lost my page. I'm not flipping at the same time that I'm flipping slides. Hang on just one second. So if it's fitting into the collection, you need to think about how does it fill a demand or a need? Does it continue a series? Does it support other items in your library? So if it correlates and connects to other things, and perhaps it supports a weak element in your library. So if you didn't have a lot of, say, cookbooks for vegans, then if you see a new item that is a vegan cookbook, then you might want to consider boosting that if it fits your community. Remember, you've got to give your community what they're looking for. So the next thing you would consider is review the performance of a similar item in your library. And this is basically where you would look up other titles on the subject or in the genre or by the author. And when I do this, I actually look up in the catalog and then view the circulation statistics for a sampling of those items. So for nonfiction, that would be a little bit different, and that's going into, for nonfiction, age of the last item on subject, that's the next point, would be a little bit different than fiction because some subjects are still okay at a certain age and some subjects are not. So for, say for instance, medical information, you want to keep the most up-to-date items in your collection, and for history that may not be the case. An older item may still be okay and you don't need a new item on some topics unless new discoveries or anniversaries roll around. I think it's the anniversary of Waterloo is coming up, bicentennial or something like that. So a couple of new materials on that may be in demand because the topic is then coming to the front lines. So you want to also look at other titles by that author, and this would include both fiction and nonfiction because some authors perform well in nonfiction and some don't. But for fiction readers, you know that they're voracious and fans out there that like specific people, like James Patterson. You know you're always going to buy James Patterson. But if it's somebody who's a midline author, which I'm going to draw a blank on, who that would be, but you would consider each one individually and say, okay, so they performed well when we first bought them, but they're kind of dropping off. So you need to decide when is the time to no longer buy that author, or either find a way to market that author to try and get them back into fruition. That might be moving them to a different branch and putting them in front of a different audience. And I've already touched on the next point, the for nonfiction age of the last item of the subject. You can't always do that for fiction because we know some authors don't put books out as often as others. Not everybody's James Patterson or Danielle Steele, who seem to be passing outlines on to ghostwriters at an astronomical rate. If you think of Gina Moll, how long it took her to put out books in her series, you can't say, well, if you have a rule in place to say, I will always buy a book by this author as long as it circulates X times a year. Well, if it's been 10 years since the last book by that author has been out, you can't always use that rule because it may have been a while since those books have circulated because of that very reason of the gap in time. So once you've determined the first 3 points, then you're going to actually look at the quality of the item in question. Now sometimes the quality doesn't matter because you're always going to buy James Patterson, you're always going to buy David Baldacci, you're always going to buy Danielle Steele and all your other bestsellers and popular authors in your library. But when you're questioning whether or not to buy either a debut author or a nonfiction book on a topic that you're considering, you want to see what the review sources say. And hopefully all of you have access to either print review sources or either online review sources that you can help with you. And these are supposed to be, should be signed by somebody. And a lot of times, like Booklist and Library Journal, they hire librarians around the country to read advanced reading copies of these things and then write reviews to give you an honest opinion of how they would fit in a library. So read those reviews and look at them, and they'll usually give you some kind of verdict and tell you what's wrong and what's great. A lot of the times, and I know I do, I have a favorite review source that I trust more than others, and this is mainly because their reviews that they give me usually fit with the way, once the item arrives in the library, the success of that item can usually be brought back to that kind of review source. So you'll find one that speaks best to your community and your collection, and that connection, once you've established that, that can be your trusted review source. It's like, well, what does Library Journal always have to say? And when if they say it's recommended, then that will usually fit with my community. So if you can, that can be half the battle won there, if you can find the one that speaks best to your community. Factors that may override the review, we've already talked about James Patterson, like bestsellers, and of course best-selling series, because if a series is going strong, like Charlene Harris became a bestseller because of her series being so popular. But there's also some other considerations, like award winners. Sometimes they're debut winners that win an award before they're published, and the publisher is now pushing them. But a lot of the times in professional reviews, they will let, especially with Library Journal pre-pub alert, they'll tell you that a publisher is doing a campaign either by selling ads. Publishers Weekly will do the same thing, or they were going to be sending this author on tour. And you'll also know that there's going to be a large first printing. Like if there's going to be over 30,000 copies of this item published, the publisher has good high hopes for this item for some reason. And sometimes you'll even be able to find out if the film rights have already been sold for a book before it's even been published, which I find very interesting. One of the other things you will do before you absolutely decide is consider your return on investment. And of course, this is going to be the total cost of the item and how it's going to perform in your library. So this is a little bit of crystal ball, and I'm sure you didn't know that you're all soothsayer, but when it comes to collection development and deciding what to buy, you are taking the risk of making a prediction of how each item is going to perform once it comes to the library. So in terms of reference materials, that would be where your biggest cost would be, but sometimes there's other nonfiction resources that recirculate that can be costly, so you want to consider that. And also, as part of cost, there's also the processing that goes into that is overall cost, and staff time, so keep all of that into consideration. And keep in mind your future use and demand. I've already mentioned that. You are looking into your own specialized crystal ball, which you understand better than anybody else because you know your community, your library, your branch, and your collections. And then you're going to determine the location and collection best for the item. So this is back to where does it fit into the collection. So if it's a fiction book that is genre and you apply genre labels, then you'll want to determine where it goes in the collection. If it's borderline teen and juvenile item, you'd want to make that kind of decision. And so once you've made that decision and it meets all the criteria that you have before you, and it seems like a lot, so just like if you remember if you did my weeding thing, a lot of things run through your mind and then you finally make your final decision. So you would select to purchase the item in the manner that you would do that. And then there's always the thing that everybody says, but I can't purchase everything. So isn't that censorship? And a lot of readings that I've seen on this, and even in the book that I looked at, talks about self-censorship. But I think that's really a bad misnomer for this kind of situation. You're selecting materials. And you're selecting materials based on your community and the needs of what your library needs to meet your community's needs. So you're not censoring material when you're making selections. You're selecting authoritative, correct, and well-reviewed items. You select what is appropriate for your community. You select what is needed and in demand by your community, and you select a balanced view in terms of your community. And this is all, if you think about this, this is echoing back to those things that I told you that were core values of ALA and from the Library Bill of Rights and from Ranganathan's 5 rules. And if you don't have the exact thing that everybody needs every time, then libraries have these wonderful networks of interlibrary loan and the internet and other resources that we can do to find information for people in our community that are, because there's always going to be somebody asking for things that we don't supply because we can't collect everything. So as long as you don't let your personal views get in the way of your selection, and I know that you will not because you're a professional and you're a librarian and you're going to be selecting things appropriately. So that's a little segue, a little interlude on censorship and selecting, because that can be a major debate between people. And I've been accused by people on staff, it's like, well, you didn't buy that because you don't read that. And I'm like, well, that's not the truth. And you can go back and support your selection process if you've gone through the steps that I provided in the former slide. And there are a lot of tools to help you with selection. And I've already mentioned a couple of those, but we're going to go through the full list because there are a lot of them out there, and you can find the ones that you like the best. But vendors are very happy to help you buy things because you're keeping them in business. And when I say vendors, these are the people that you buy books from. And there are several of them out there. Ingram, Baker and Taylor, and Brodart are the big ones, but some libraries also buy from Amazon. So you can use vendors' websites and their special services. Ingram I just moved over to Ingram, and they have a lot of great things that I can use to help me order books. They create lists for me. They provide the review journals. And some, like Baker and Taylor, publishes an actual physical magazine called Forecast that will give you a list of all of the things that are being published for a given month. They will also be present at trade shows and at library conferences like PLA and LLA to help you out. And bookstores are also vendors, so if you are a lover of books, I'm sure you spend time in bookstores. And so it's good to see what bookstores are promoting, because they're promoting those for a reason, because the publishers are pushing them, or the media is pushing them, or they're in demand by their users who have found out them from a different reason. So if you get the time to go to a bookstore, it's good to pay attention to what you see there. And a lot of times I have my cell phone out taking pictures of books that I will then go back and research at the library to see if they can fit into my collection. Publishers are another good resource, but of course publishers want you to buy their books more than anything else, so you got to take their stuff with a grain of salt, but they're a good resource to start getting a list of titles to look at. And again, they have great websites. They will provide you with advanced reading copies if you can get on those kind of lists. There's also services now where you can get advanced reading copies via ebooks. One of those is a service called Edelweiss. If you're not familiar with that, that's a great thing to sign up for. It also gives you access to online catalogs that publishers put out there. Every time I go to ALA or PLA and I see a publisher at one of those shows that I know does well at my library, I always make sure to let them scan my little card so that I get on to their mailing list or their email list, so that you can get alerts for what's the new stuff coming out for the next quarter. And some of those publishers are so great that they'll make sure to give you a advance notice for stuff up to a year, so that's really helpful. And then of course there are the professional review sources, and I've already hinted at a lot of those. The ones that I use are Kirkus, Booklist, Library Journal, and Publishers Weekly. And I used to subscribe to all those in print, but Ingram will give those to me for a fee, which is cheaper than buying one of those alone. My children's staff uses School Library Journal, Voya, Hornbook, and there's one more that I'm forgetting because of course I forgot to write it down, so I apologize for that. But there's specialized sources for each, and Booklist will give you all ages because that one goes that way, and Booklist is famous for its starred children's and teen reviews, so that's a good one to always make sure and use for your children's resources. Reviews also can be from other professional places. Library Reads is a resource that is now very big. If you haven't heard of Library Reads, go look it up. It's a thing that was created by librarians to basically let their voice be heard for things that they're excited about that are coming out. And these are not always established authors, but they can also be up-and-coming debuts. There's been some really great books that have come through that you'll want to get into the hands of your patrons that your colleagues are recommending. And the way that you can get involved with Library Reads is if you sign up at the Edelweiss website that I mentioned. You can vote on what is a library read, and you can also sign up for ebooks that you can then review and then nominate to be a Library Reads. And you can go to the Library Reads website and print out flyers every month to promote what gets voted as Library Reads titles every month. So your colleagues also are a good resource. Patrons, of course, we know, love to tell us what we should have bought and when we should have bought it, and they often tell us about things that are forthcoming that we can't even purchase yet. My favorite is when they ask for the DVD for the movie that isn't even in theaters yet. That's always fun. But it's good to pay attention to what patrons are asking for, because they are who we are serving. So where do you look for these requests? You can have request forms that your patrons can fill out as a mechanism to notify you, but sometimes that can be a little overbearing. Pay attention to what's being interlibrary loaned or sent from branch to branch a lot. That's a good way to see that maybe you should have that item at your branch, or that may be something you would consider purchasing. I know the lady who does our interlibrary loan here always lets me know if she loans something more than twice, that maybe we should consider ordering that material. So I will look it up and then go through my analysis and make a decision for that. Patrons get their stuff from word of mouth and from media, and then of course if they're in book clubs, that's another way they would demand stuff. So listening to NPR, watching the morning show, if you can manage it, that's a good place to find, to be in line with the patron and not be so surprised when they ask for things. And then of course there's frontline feedback, which would come from your staff. Hopefully there's a mechanism in place too for them to let you know if your reference staff or your reader's advisory staff keep getting a request for a book over and over. Hopefully they know to let somebody know that that resource is not being met. And because not every patron is going to want to go through the ILL process, or if you have a policy in place where you can't interlibrary loan brand new materials, then there needs to be a way to let the person who's ordering materials get a list of those titles so that they can then consider them for purchase. And I've already mentioned the multiple branch transfer. So it may be in a specific branch, but it's more popular somewhere else, or it's also popular somewhere else. So there may need to be a change in procedure to say, we'll start purchasing these kind of materials for this branch as well, and including this collection. And then of course there is the tried and true numbers statistic reports that you can get out of your ILS system. And these would be CIRC reports, and you should be able to run these by branch, by collection, and by holdings within those collections. If you can run it for specific Dewey numbers, that's really great, especially for libraries who like to do budgets by Dewey number. Hopefully somebody's running a report to make sure that those numbers correspond with the budget that's being spent. And of course the all-powerful holds report. If you can get your hands on how many people are on hold for certain titles, that would be a very good indication of what you should be ordering and how many you should be ordering. And I haven't mentioned copies anywhere in here, but that would be a good indicator, especially if you're new, how to establish how many copies to buy per branch or at all. So tending your collection, this is where some professionals would say this is a job of another department, but I think it's very important, and I've mentioned this in my weeding talks, that if you're the person responsible for ordering a thing, then you should be responsible for figuring out when it's time for it to leave. That shouldn't be somebody else's decision, because you knew why the library needed it, so you should also have a reason why the library no longer needs it. So collection management deals with weeding, conservation versus replacement, and new collections. So you're constantly reviewing your collection as it is, but there should also be a time and a place and a season for even these things to happen as well. But weeding is part of, as I've mentioned, part of the life cycle of materials, and should be done constantly and at specific times. And it should be a well review done item by item or through a report done through your ILS. And when you do the weeding process, this may also adapt or reflect a change that needs to go into your procedures. No longer need to purchase X kind of materials because we're weeding all of these materials. And it may be a wake-up call. That's why I'm saying a person that is responsible for ordering should also be weeding, because it may educate them about perception that they think they have, and it's been so long since they've done a community assessment or have looked at the collection that the weeding is the time when you finally realize that changes need to be made in what you're collecting. Conservation versus replacement, and conservation would mean how many more circulations can we get out of an item. Sometimes the item is out of print, so you need to try and hang on to it if it's still popular as long as possible. But if a replacement is available through a vendor, and a lot of classics and a lot of modern day classics can also be purchased to replace nastier and falling apart titles, which patrons have a tendency not to want to check out. That's one of the beautiful things about donations, is that patrons can give us pristine copies of hardback books that may be in very bad shape on the shelf. So I love donations for that one very reason. And then, of course, you need to think about new collections and old collections. And, of course, old collections would go back to weeding. When is it time for old collection to go out to pasture to make way for new collections? And new collections are usually new formats these days. So we've got all of our e-content, e-books, Blu-ray. If you haven't started a Blu-ray collection, that is definitely here to stay. It's been a mainstay for a while now. And then MP3, CD, audiobooks. Most cars now can play those types of CDs in their car. So is it time to get that as well as CD? So one of the things you could actually think about is how many different formats per title would you also need? So that is part of the collection format question. And those are all the different kinds of things that you would think about. Now, I know we've talked about many, many things at one time, so hopefully if you have some questions, you can let me know, and I can also flip back to slides if you want to see something that you weren't able to write down. So feel free to click, and I know that Jamie provides all these slides to you for SlideShare as well. So in review, I would say, if anything, if your system can have a copy of Fundamentals of Collection Development and Management on hand as a reference, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, it is a pretty dense book, but it also covers every question you can think of. Because anytime I had a question for this, I did go back to make sure that I knew what I was talking about, and make sure that you have a procedure in mind as you do this, and that you're covering as much ground as possible so that you can support the needs of your community. Because remember, back to the bigger picture, we're there to serve the people that walk into our library every day or accessing our e-content every day. So we need to keep them first and foremost in mind. So I'm open for any questions at this time.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. So as Jeremy said, he's open for questions. If you have any questions about weeding, Jeremy, you could probably take those as well, I would think. Oh, Jeremy, are you not hearing me? Jeremy, do you hear me? Oh, no. Okay. We were having some sound issues beforehand. He's not hearing anything. Okay. So if you guys will just be patient with me, I am just going to type the questions, copy and paste them into the chat box, and then Jeremy can give us a response. Okay, so Jeremy, I'm sending a question to you. Also wanted to mention to all of you that Rosalie had a question, and I did put that in the chat box. She wanted to know if any of you had a good collection development policy you'd be willing to share, and her email was listed in there as well.
Oh, I see a question. I have to scroll down. Self-published to be added to our collections. How are you handling these kinds of requests? Okay, for me, I kind of take these requests with a grain of salt. It depends. Well, I'm not going to say anything nasty. I do the same amount of research that I can possibly do as the steps that I've given you. I go, and in this case, the first thing I do is see if it's available through Ingram, because Ingram does sell a lot of self-published titles, and that lets me know that that person is actually trying to make an impact somehow. So if Ingram is carrying it, then that's a good indication. Amazon a lot of times will carry these things because the person can send copies to Amazon to sell, and that's part of the business. So there can be actual reviews on Amazon. Now you have to be careful with user reviews on Amazon because it could be the actual person who wrote the book, and it also could be friends of the person that wrote the book. So most times, if it's patrons asking for them, then I will consider them more than if a person walks in trying to sell me a self-published book. And I have made a couple of enemies with local people that have written books when I won't buy their $30 110-page novel that they want me to purchase. And I usually use the evidence, that the criteria that I gave you on that slide, to support why I will not just buy it sight unseen. And sometimes I will offer to let them leave a copy with me, and I will look through it, but that's not really a fair assessment either. One person's opinion isn't always good. I always try to say I need professional reviews. Who published it? Has it been professionally edited? That's another good question to ask these people, because sometimes editing on those things can be pretty terrible. I will also say that Kirkus does have an indie review source in the back of their stuff, so that's a good place, and I have bought some self-published stuff based on what Kirkus has said, and a few of those have been tanks. They haven't worked out here, because another thing about self-published material is that sometimes it doesn't have a back cover or even a spine with anything printed on it. So you get this thing with a cover, and that's all. It doesn't say anything about the book, so you know once that's out there, beyond the people who asked for it are not really going to read it. I hope that addresses that question okay. And because I see two more. As far as medical and travel books, what guidelines do you use for weeding and their publication dates? That's a great question, because I forgot to mention that. If you can go to the Texas Library, the Texas State Library or the Texas State Association, or if you just look up Crew Manual, it's a publication that the state of Texas put together, and they will let you download for free. It's a PDF, and they've even updated it to include e-material. But there is criteria for every single Dewey number, every kind of collection. What are the acceptable dates for weeding, and how long it should be before you get rid of them. But for travel guides, you probably want to get one at least every other year, if not every year, if you can afford it. That could also be driven by what's popular and what's not. And there's a third question. Personal views shouldn't get in the way of selection. Any tips on this, especially if you are just starting out in collection development? Okay, this just goes back to core librarianship. You just have to, I can't explain it any other way, but you have a professional hat that you wear when you sit down in front of a catalog or your reviews that you have to remember, and you can't be offended, or you can be offended by the content of what it is. But if you know that your patrons want it and they're reading it, then it's money well spent, and it's not your job as a librarian goes back to the ALA, core values, and Bill of Rights. You are there to protect intellectual freedom and those who want the knowledge that they want. So if there is a legitimate demand for a specific thing, if it's a contrary political belief that you don't go for, if it contains content of a sexual orientation or a sexual manner that you're not comfortable with, if your patrons are reading it and it's not, then there's no reason why you shouldn't purchase it. Any other questions, or if anybody would like to who made those three questions can ask me something else if I didn't cover everything they wanted to know. Besides Library Journal and Publishers Weekly, what are some of the best sources of reviews for Spanish language materials? Oh gosh, you're asking somebody who has no Spanish. Well, I have a Spanish language collection, but it is microscopic and it's not done well. Says they're aware of America Speaks Spanish and Hispanically speaking news websites. Then you probably know more than I do. What's the other one? Bookspan. When we were building our Spanish collection, we actually used Amazon quite a bit. There is a way for you to search for Spanish or specific languages through Amazon, and we used the best-selling stuff from Amazon as well. And then you could also search for if they want popular material, and if you wanted to know if it was available in translation, that was an easy way to do that. How often does our library weed? I always have a weeding project going on. There's one somewhere in one part of the collection. Right now, I just got finished weeding my large print collection, my general fiction, and I'm getting ready to do audiobooks. And that was the reason that it had to be done at this time is because we were running out of space. So sometimes space is a good indicator of what needs to be weeded. If you're bursting at the seams somewhere, then it's time for a weeding project.
Okay, I think that wraps up the questions. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I know that's not easy when you can't hear us, but I think we made the chat function work pretty well. So Jeremy's email is on your screen. I know he would be happy to take any follow-up questions that you have. As I mentioned, we are recording this. The recording and Jeremy's slides will be sent to you in your follow-up email, hoping to get that out to you today. So again, I want to thank Jeremy for his presentation. I want to thank all of you for participating. I hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week. So long.